That fall, Donna moved Sheba and Flash to a different place to board. Bo was still at the farm until the following year when Roni sold her. I had Raisin home that Christmas. We had Tex, Fury, Mighty, and Useless. Raisin regained his vigor, muscle, and hoof condition on our feeding program over the winter. There were several places in the corrals that had terrible icy patches on them. One morning I went out to chore to find Useless lying on the ice, unable to get up. I put straw under her and pushed and pulled her so she could get some traction because she was trying to get up on her own. Once I provided her with the traction she needed, I thought she would jump up and everything would be okay. It was not to be. Useless got up and did a complete somersault, tumbled to the ground again. Something was horribly wrong. I made her comfortable with straw and let her lay there while I ran to the house to get Mom. I was so upset I could not stand to see Useless trying to get up and falling down all the time. It was heartbreaking. Mom called the vet, but I was so upset I got in my car and went for coffee in town with Donna. My mom found me later and told me that Useless had broken her neck in the fall and the vet came out and euthanized her. Dad buried her out in the little field behind the corrals. I wish I could have been strong enough to stay there with Useless when the vet came. I was such a coward. This experience would change me for the better later in life. Tex sold at a ranch horse sale in the spring, and I was happy with the price I got for him. He was the highest selling horse at the sale, and he was also the prettiest one there. By that time, his mane was nearly 2 feet of white spilling down his golden neck, and his gleaming white tail hung to the ground. I completed high school and attended my graduation that June, then worked with Dad on the construction for the summer. It was a good learning experience and an opportunity to spend time with my dad. I learned the fundamentals of a good building, how to operate power tools and equipment. We all had to learn to operate equipment at the farm. That's just the way it is. I think it's good for a woman to learn how to do things for herself. It built character and shaped me into the person I would become. Remember the rancher that helped us find and buy Raisin? His name was Glenn. He became a really good friend of the family and like another uncle to me. He sold his ranch near Pie Pot and gave me an old saddle of his that he had in his barn at the ranch. No one in his family wanted it, and he wanted me to have it. The saddle was gray with dust and dried out from being exposed in an old barn. It had pigeon droppings on it, and the ties were either chewed or rotted off of it. I wiped the dirt off and cleaned it up most of the way and took it into the saddle maker that put new ties on it for us. When I got it home, it was still despicable. Upon close inspection, I discovered there was dirt and sweat caked on the underside of the stirrup leathers that made the leather stiff like wood. I vowed that saddle was getting a complete makeover. After scraping the caked-on sweat and dirt off, it still took many coats of warmed oil on the leather before it finally began to soften and become flexible again. When I was done with the makeover, I had a usable piece of equipment. The saddle was an old antique high-back saddle with brass saddle horn and brass coverings on the wooden stirrups. Glenn may have had the felt replaced on the underside before I got the saddle. It had large square skirts with horseshoe stamps in the corners, the stirrups laced up. I replaced the leather thongs on the stirrup leathers and lengthened the stirrups long enough for me to ride in it. Whoever rode the saddle before it came into my possession had short legs. Then I outfitted the saddle with a new latigo, billet strap and girth, and saddled Fury to try it out. Now there is a trick to riding in a high back saddle. You want to have an excellent seat and you do not want to post or bounce in this type of saddle. If you do either of these things, the saddle will spank you for trying. I only had to try to post once to figure this out. The saddle seat measures a small 14 inches, and when you sit in it, you are in it. The pommels are also high on this saddle. I rode Fury a fair amount with this saddle because it fit his wide back better than any other saddle I owned at the time, but I still preferred riding Fury bareback. Late that August, Glenn was trucking cattle to southern Ontario, so I caught a ride with him to go visit my cousins near Grand Valley. While I was there, I applied for a job working on a thoroughbred horse farm. My horse experience guaranteed my acceptance. I made a flying trip home to Saskatchewan to get my car. The round trip consisted of more than 6,000 kilometers and 4 days to complete. I was ready to start my new job. The job at the thoroughbred farm was a huge eye-opener and experience to say the least. There were 3 other young people working at the same farm and had much less experience with horses than I did. They had worked at the farm for some time and therefore showed me what the boss expected. Work started at 6:30 every morning. We mucked stalls in 3 barns, 1 each, for yearlings, mares, and the stallions. We were only allowed to handle the yearlings, mares and foals, which had to be taken out to their respective pastures before we mucked out the barns. The stallions on the farm were only handled by the stallion handler, who was also the foreman. The thoroughbred stallions were nothing like my little Fury as a stallion. Through the bars of their stalls or in their pastures was where we observed the rambunctious and aggressive stallions. The 4 of them standing at the farm had to be led out with either a bit or chain in their mouth, and even then they were a real handful for the stallion handler. They scared the tar out of me, and I was glad that I did not have to lead them. They were beautiful to look at, though. Once the horses were fed, led out to pasture, the stalls mucked out, and the floors in the stately barns were all clean enough to eat off, we would have lunch. We didn't eat off the floors really, but they were immaculately kept barns. After lunch, we had to bring the yearlings in for grooming. There were 4 of us grooming horses, and we each had 3 horses to groom in the afternoon for a total of 12 yearlings. Sounds simple enough and shouldn't take too long at all. Wrong. While we were mucking stalls, those yearlings were out in their pasture being little pigs. They were filthy when they came in from the paddock. After 2 weeks of grooming them every day, I swear that the owner had a mud or dirt pit out there for them to play in on purpose. These were long yearlings and would be 2 in March or April when the thoroughbred foaling takes place. Some of the yearlings were nearly 16 hands high, and they had very little manners. The yearlings were outfitted with a leather halter, and we had to clip a bit called a chiffney onto their halters to lead them. Even with the circular bit in their mouths, the yearlings were quite a handful to bring in from the pasture. Back to grooming. We had to dry shampoo each yearling until they passed the white glove test. If you are unfamiliar with the white glove test, it is this. Any prospective buyer of the horse could come in with snow white gloves on and rub their fingers anywhere on the horse, and if they looked at the fingertips of the gloves and there was any dirt there, we were in deep trouble. Oftentimes, we would team up, and 3 or sometimes 4 of us would be working on 1 horse at a time to get them cleaned quicker. If we were good and fast, we could do 2 horses in an hour. We couldn't go home until the yearlings were cleaned. This way, the owner of the farm could show his yearlings to prospective buyers in the evening. These yearlings were being prepared for the big yearling sale that takes place every October at the Woodbine Racetrack in Toronto. I got into a routine and got to know the people I worked with. We had as much fun as we could while working. 3 weeks went by quickly, and it was time for the big sale. One of the people I worked with would stay at the farm, and the rest of us would be going with the horses to the Woodbine Racetrack to work there for the week of the sale. I packed my bag for a week and stayed at a hotel near the racetrack while we were at the sale that week. 2 other girls would be my roommates. First, we had to load the yearlings into the big semi-horse trailer to take them to the Woodbine. I had never seen a trailer such as this. It had box stalls in it and other large stalls. The horses went up a ramp into the side of the semi-trailer, only 10 horses per trailer. There were 4 trailers because we stopped at other farms to pick up more yearlings. We rode in the trailer with the yearlings. Pulling into the Woodbine is an experience if you've never been there. It is a huge facility for horse racing. I can only imagine what the Kentucky Derby Horse Park looks like. I've only ever seen it on movies. There were rows upon rows of horse barns and lights everywhere in the darkness, nearly as bright as day. I came from a little city of 16,000 people, and working on the comfort of the thoroughbred farm did not prepare me for this. We unloaded the yearlings into the horse barns, one semi-load after another. Then we went back for a second load of yearlings. The horses were fed for the night, and we were taken to our hotel room to settle in and get something to eat. By that time it was late. We were tired, and the schedule for the next 5 days would be grueling. Each morning we had to be up and at the barns by 5:30 a.m. First, we fed all of the horses. I believe there were 128 yearling thoroughbreds at the sale that year. We would take turns with our teammate. One would take the yearling from his or her stall and walk the horse, while the other teammate would muck out and rebed the stall with shavings. The horse would go back into its stall, and we would go on to the next horse. At 8 a.m., we were allowed to go to the mess hall for breakfast for a half hour. Then we went back to walking yearlings and mucking stalls until lunchtime. I recall that lunch was around 11:30, and we were given a half hour to eat lunch. In the afternoon, we groomed horses. We always worked in teams on the horses. It was grueling physical labor, and we weren't always working with horses we were familiar with. Some of the stud colts were nasty and would bite. I don't remember the exact number of us laborers that were walking, mucking, and grooming. It took all day to just do all of those things for 128 horses. It seemed that we never got out of there for supper until after 8. Then we were young and stupid, so we would go out and eat supper, party until midnight, go to sleep, and do it all again the next day. The second day at the woodbine, I could hardly walk. I had been wearing runners because it was easier to lead the yearlings and run alongside them, but I ended up with shin splints so bad I was worse than a lame horse. The only thing I could think of to put on my shins was some liniment called Wonder Oil. I happened to have it with me that day. Wonder Oil was something my grouse mama and mom always used when I was growing up. I ditched the runners for my well-torn orange cowboy boots, put the Wonder Oil on my shins, tucked my jeans in my boots, and within an hour I was walking normal. The shin splints went away. Oh, relief. The day went by in a blur, mucking, walking, and grooming, until once again it was late and I was starving. After a quick shower, we ate supper, partied with roommates until midnight, and went to sleep so we could be back at the track again at 5:30 to do it all again. The third day at the woodbine, a yearling being groomed by someone else bit me in the back of my arm as I walked by. I reacted with violence and punched the horse in the muzzle before he could let go of my arm. Wonder Oil to the rescue. I still had a big bruise on the back of my arm, and it hurt for days. It made every single thing I had to do more difficult and painful. More of the same for the rest of the day. It was rather mundane in that aspect. On the 5th day I was a wreck. I could no longer keep up this pace. I collapsed under a horse from sheer exhaustion and lack of proper nourishment early that afternoon, and was taken back to the hotel room. I showered and had a nap. At 5:30 I called my cousin Randy and told him what had happened. He offered to pick me up and take me out for supper. Randy told me to dress up. Dress up? Oh boy, he had no idea what a tall order he had just asked from me. I only had barn work clothes with, nothing fancy at all, and my orange cowboy boots were better than the runners. I found a pair of gray jeans without holes in them that weren't too dirty, a clean t-shirt, my orange cowboy boots, and my jean jacket. That was the best I could do. Randy was at the hotel within an hour to pick me up. I was already a sight all by myself, and I was paired with a 6 foot 6 inch, 200-pound Randy, sporting long red hair in a ponytail, wearing jeans, black cowboy boots, and a black leather jacket. You are getting the picture. He looked like a biker, and a really big, mean one, with a mustache and a goatee. To look at Randy, you would never know he was a sweetheart and a real gentleman. He asked me if I was ready to go, and I laughed because I knew that we were looking quite the pair. I had no idea where we were going as Randy sped through Toronto. I was so out of my league here. Randy pointed out the CN Tower for me. It was dark out by now, and the lights were amazing. I was in awe of the sights of the city. Randy informed me that that is where he is taking me for supper. He had a reservation. We entered the tower at ground level and then went through security to take the elevator to the top. A young man dressed in uniform operated the elevator that we took to go up to the rotating restaurant on the top of the CN Tower. The uniformed young man was trying really hard not to look at us funny as he asked where we were from. I was not about to say anything. Randy, however, told this young man that he is from Toronto and I am his friend from Romania. I can't speak a word of English, and he is showing me the sights of the city. Then Randy looked at me and rubbed his stomach and asked me if I was hungry. Somehow we made it off of the elevator without bursting into fits of hysterical laughter. We departed the elevator and were at the entrance of the restaurant. Now this is a fancy restaurant. There was a maitre d', or whatever they were called, at the doorway. Randy took my arm and walked up to the maitre d', and in his most gentlemanly voice said that we have a reservation under Randall Schroeder. The maitre d' glowered at us and said that there was a strict dress code for the restaurant and we do not meet the dress code requirements. Randy dropped my arm and stepped forward so that he was looking down and over the maitre d' and said in hushed tones that we are not leaving and expect to be seated promptly. The maitre d' stepped back as he looked up at Randy and stammered, "Why, sir, I think I may just have the seat for you and your companion." We were taken to the lounge and sat in the center that was stationary. We couldn't sit close to the windows where you can see all of Toronto. The entire restaurant rotates, which I found fascinating. We had a lovely supper regardless of the circumstances, and when we left, we laughed so hard we had tears rolling down our faces. Randy took me back to Grand Valley that night to stay at my aunt and uncle's. What started out to be a bad day had turned out to be great and memorable because my cousin Randy was the best. I called the stud farm the next morning and quit that job. I waited until the end of the following week to get my pay before I drove 3,000 kilometers home to Saskatchewan. I wanted to get home before the snow was flying. I didn't know it at the time, but later came to realize that I had gained employment at one of the most prestigious stud farms in Canada. I still have the stallion portfolio from Park Stud. I had worked for Michael Byrne, and the thoroughbred stallions there were Geiger Counter, Always Run Lucky, Brave Shot, and Bold Ruckus, standing at stud the year I worked there.